Welcome to the Over the Hump Podcast, your gateway to the world of the iconic Brahman breed of cattle. At BRC Ranch, our passion for Brahman cattle runs deep. Join us as we delve into the heart of this extraordinary breed, unveiling its rich history, exploring industry trends, and sharing captivating stories that define the American Brahman. BRC Ranch stands as the pinnacle of Brahman excellence in America, boasting a decade-long legacy of champions and housing the finest Brahman bulls worldwide. It's not just about cattle, it's about a legacy that reverberates across ranches and hearts. Brought to you by BRC Ranch, where the Brahman legacy thrives and stories are woven into the very fabric of ranching. This is Over the Hump. And now your hosts, Brendan Cottrell, Rachel Cottrell, and Keaton Dodd.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Over the Hump Podcast. Now, I'm your host, Keaton Dodd, with me, my good friend Brandon Cottrell, and we have an exciting guest, and I'll let Brandon get into introducing our first guest here, but somebody that's near and dear to both of us and a good friend of the Brahman breed. Brandon, if you want to go ahead and introduce.
Absolutely. So we're glad to be back with you guys and just really have a good time this morning. I know I'm going to enjoy it, and I hope everybody else does too. But we talked a little about it in our previous podcast about some of this was going to be a little Brahman history and things like that. And we talked about how much of a history buff I am. And I've always been pretty good at the herdsman quiz and quiz bowls and things like that at the All-American. And I think every single question, every single quiz bowl or herdsman quiz that I've taken at the All-American over the years for the however long I've been doing it has had one of the same questions on it every year, and it's who's the father of ABBA. And most everybody's going to be able to know that, and that's going to be J.W. Sartwelle. Well, our guest today, you could probably call him the voice of the All-American, the voice of TJBA, and I like to refer to him as the great-grandson of the ABBA, Mr. James Dinsmore Sartwelle III. And we're glad to have you today, and welcome, Jimmy.
Glad to be with y'all. Appreciate what y'all are doing.
Well, Jimmy, I guess to get things started, we just kind of want to jump right into Sartwelle Brothers, the beginning of Sartwelle family in the Brahman business. And so if you could just kind of tell us a little bit about yourself, your family, and all the things that y'all have done for the Brahman breed.
I appreciate doing it. I'll start out by saying what the three immediately in the line in front of me would have said, which it's been a labor of love for now close to 110 years. Our story with the Brahman cattle starts way back in 1911, 12, 13, when J.W. Sartwelle was the railroad station agent at Menard, Texas. And that was a offloading point and an overnight point for lots of cattle that were shipped by rail off the Gulf Coast that were headed north north to packing country. What he noticed and what he saw as they offloaded all these cattle was that there were some slick-haired cattle that just seemed to be a little more thrifty, carry a little bit more flesh, seem to be bothered a lot less by flies or whatever the disease of the season was, and got really curious. A lot of those cattle were shipped by the Ward family, Mr. Lafayette Ward, A.W. Ward. Those are the forebears of Joe Ward and West Ward down in South Texas and Vanderbilt and points in between. Over the years of observing those cattle coming through, he struck up a relationship with the Wards to the extent that he went to work for them, moving to Blessing to manage most of those ranching operations for them. After a series of reversals in the late teens and in in the late teens, those cattle were in that ranch was placed in receivership, bankruptcy court out of San Antonio. JW knew that a lot of those cattle were descendants from the 1906 importation. He had done an extensive amount of work researching those cattle, reading everything he could get from the 1800s on, printed by the British government, by USDA, bits and pieces of what he could pick up of the Barra cattle, what he could pick up of the cattle that came into South Carolina in 1849, and he'd gotten the bug by that point. To the extent he asked the bankruptcy judge there in San Antonio to appoint him the receiver of those cattle and provide him an opportunity to find an alternate owner. He found a man named Mr. Fred Locke. The Locks were rice farmers who had interest in Louisiana and over on the west side of Houston, uh, and he got the opportunity to keep those cattle intact and sell them to Mr. Fred Locke. Whereupon he went from managing the cattle for the wards to managing them for the court to managing them for Mr. Fred Locke, to the point in November 1920 he and one of five brothers and two sisters were able to purchase those cattle, purchase the Crescent V brand that had been on the cattle from the ward days on, from Mr. Locke, and take over kind of official Sartwelle ownership of those cattle in November of 1920, and that's the foundation of where the story of the Sartwelle brothers begins.
And Jimmy, where would this have been at? I guess where was the first location, Sartwelle Brothers? Not to interrupt you.
Oh, no, you're good. The cattle were down kind of Jackson, Calhoun, western edge of Wharton County. Um, if you backtrack back in our family history, we had where the name Dinsmore comes from, and our family was Judge Silas Dinsmore, who was a magistrate judge under the Spaniards, under the Mexicans, and then under the Republic of Texas, and ultimately the state of Texas. There in Matagorda County, he received lands from his service to the Republic that were chiefly located right there on the western side of Tres Palacios Bay, below Palacios, but family lands up into Jackson County, Calhoun counties as well. Um, those lands have been in the family since the 1840s. They'd been leased out to Shanghai Pierce for years and years, which is kind of another point of contact in the story back to the Pierce estate. And the family, those brothers had the dream. Dinsmore, J.W., Pascal, Henry, and George all had the dream of going back and taking those family lands back and running their own cattle on them. And that all comes to a head there in 1919, 1920, with the purchase of those lot cattle and the moving of those cattle principally down to Matagorda County.
And that's when y'all got to Palacios, I guess, was from that point the cattle were out of Palacios.
That's where the cattle were out of Palacios. They're west of town off Highway 35 and FM 521, where it wound up being where that headquarters sat, and where the cattle stayed from the purchase in 1920 until the cattle were removed, and the largest part of the cattle were sold in 1971 and 2 to Clive Runnels' AP Ranch, and Dad and Grandpa bought 50 cows off that group. So they were there at Palacios before we moved the Sartwelle Brahman Ranch cows up to Sealy in 72. They spent 52 years right there in Palacios. Oh, it's a pretty terrible saltgrass country.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Not the greatest place in the world for a cow, but we thrived and built a herd and built a reputation right on that place.
Probably why there's so much function built into those cows even still today, is they had to make it on rough country.
And if they can make it there, they can make it anywhere in the world.
As Dad was fond of saying, if a cow can thrive there, anywhere you take her is going to be better than where she left. So
It's all uphill from here. Well, can you tell me about, like in those early days, some of the influential animals that might have played a role in not only the formation of the breed, but also, I mean, main formation of Sartwell brothers?
Well, Brandon, if you go back and we've got the original handwritten Dinsmore and J.W. Sartwell uh, records on these cows, and if you go back prior to the 24 importation, what we had acquired from the Ward cattle, what Hudgens was able to acquire of the O'Connor Pierce cattle as well. Uh, we had a leg up in that those two herds really possessed the lion's share of the pure Indian cattle that had come in the '06 importation. So really the bulls that were probably the most influential bulls of the pre 24 era would have been Three Circle. Three Circle was a bull that Dr. Jacobs wrote of a lot. That he figured was probably one of the more influential bulls of the '06 importation. But we had bulls Teddy Roosevelt and President Wilson that were both really influential, that were calves sired by Three Circle and by others of those 1906 bulls, just by virtue of the fact that the 24 bulls got spread out to more owners, and they hadn't quite through the tribulations that those '06 cattle came through, getting stuck in New York Harbor on their way in because of the aftosa outbreak in India while those cattle were in transit. There's just a lot more known about them, but suffice it to say, those '06 cattle, because they stayed in two ranches' hands, and by and large migrated to two ranches, wound up being a pretty solid base to build off of. Then you get to the 24 importation, and that's when the match and the match met the straw, so to speak, and the fire really got started. Sartwell Brothers bought six bulls out of the original. Aristocrata was one of them. There was a dark bull who my grandfather always described as totally black on the head, black past the shoulders, black from the hips back, steel gray across the barrel, with two big, about the size of a basketball and about the color of a basketball, orange spots, one on each side of them, named Imperator. Of course, you're dealing with Sartwell Brothers at that time. Um, had put everything they had on the line to borrow the money to go buy those cows from Mr. Fred Locke, and really didn't have just a whole lot of excess capital available. And the Imperator bull that JW really liked, of course, didn't have the funds to get him secured. So he had a friend of his named Walter Weathersby at Del Rio. Mr. Weathersby bought the bull, used him for as near as we can figure about a year and a half before JW went down and bought the bull from Mr. Weathersby and brought him back to Palatia. And then we spent. There are only 5 calf crops that were sired by Imperator. The last one there in 1929. Um, he made his mark through dozens of daughters and through his son Imperator the second, ABBA 3001. Um, and what Dinsmore Sartwell and JW spent all the way up to the late 30s doing was back crossing Aristocrata on Imperator daughters, breeding Imperator, and then later Imperator the second, and then other Imperator sons, Emperor of India being chief among them, back on Aristocrata daughters. At the same time, Um, if you think about it, and you're fairly well versed in the history of the breed, probably the person who very quickly gravitated to the idea of quote unquote purebred Indian cattle being sired by import bulls out of import cows was Dr. William States Jacobs of Houston. He was a Presbyterian minister and, by all accounts, an extraordinarily strong personality. Um, we borrowed a bull from Dr. Jacobs named Blutine, who was a son of the import bull Martine. Um, and really, what we think of as the Sartwelle Imperator cattle now is a three-way blend of Blutine, Imperator, and Aristocrata. Obviously, the genetic impact of Imperator that pulls through to this date is the dark pigment, all the way down through it, including dark testicles, and in cases of lots of these more intensively bred cows, lots and lots of dark pigment down in the udders and teats as well. But that's the blue teen. We bred bulls, um, blue teen back to Imperator daughters, blue teen to Aristocrata daughters. We bred bulls numbered all the way up to blue teen the eighth, up into the late 50s. So really, in that first 30 years in Palacios, a strong Imperator, a strong Aristocrata base. Of course, Aristocrata on Penelope's, where Manso comes from.
Yeah,
Um,
Jimmy, not to interrupt you, but this was actually my next topic, and I think it's really interesting. Nowadays, Brahman, you could probably, if you were going to say that there's distinct bloodlines, the last two that maybe are truly distinct bloodlines would be people talk about the Manso cattle, and obviously everybody knows about that bull, and they've probably heard the story. And I would think that most know about Imperator, but the interesting fact is those cattle both trace their roots back to Palacios, Texas, and your forefathers. So now, just tell us more about that. I guess I didn't mean to interrupt, but you were heading in the same direction I was.
no, and again, one could almost argue that the Manso cattle are not really because they're so pervasive, um, but have been taken in so many different directions by different folks that maybe the Manso cattle are not a distinct bloodline unto themselves.
I
Our
agree with
cattle have been, and I don't know that's for geneticists to discuss. But typically, when we think of Manso cattle today, they dang sure don't have a lot of Suva blood in them, which would have been probably the last distinct line of Brahman cattle that we've kind of bred out of distinction as a separate bloodline. Um, but the Imperator cattle that we have bred, we've stayed pretty true to our core for a long time. Whether it's just stubbornness, but when you go back to what J.W. prized about those cattle, sitting there in that railroad station in Menard, Texas, watching those cattle unload and get back on train cars, to date, the adaptability, the versatility of the cattle, uh, it's remained really unchanged. Now, where the cattle went um, from Palacios, of course, everyone's familiar with the story of how Manso got to Mrs. Alberta Gale, and then got to Walter Hudgens, and then Edgar did what Edgar did with them, which was one of the more phenomenal stories in the history of livestock breeding. Um, what he was able to do with concentrating the blood off that bull. Um, Cattle that left Imperator sons that left Palacios. Emperor of India at the end of his life went to the Stuarts in Florida. That's a lot of the foundation of the Imperator breeding in the Stuart cattle. Emperistri, an Imperator's son, Emperistri 423, went to the Partons in Florida. forms a basis of the famous Emperor bull. Of course, when Emperor came to Hudgens there after World War II, a lot of the Hudgens blood went back to Florida after the fact, prior to and after the fact. And the Partons spent a long time crisscrossing their Emperor history in Manso cattle as well. The cattle wound up at Duda. Clyde Goodo tells a story about bull number 31 with a one that got to Duda's, that hooked a horse of his and tore it up pretty good in the pens one day there at Cocoa. But a lot of the foundation of the Florida cattle, uh, King Gray. Uh, King Gray comes back from Imperator breeding, which was a famous bull bred used by the Marceaus, of course, King of Kaplan, an own son of Imperator, that they bred to great effect, and kind of still lives and lurks in the back of some semen tanks today from some folks who are brave enough to try it and use it. Um, but there was a lot of cattle that left Palacios, Texas, to all points of the globe, and wound up serving as the foundation for lots of herds all across the Gulf Coast and around the world.
That's bringing that up. Just things that starting out small and grow big. Just those cattle that were there, basically at Palacios, and then started stretching out like spider webs throughout the southern part of the U.S. here, but then ultimately impacting herds all over the entire world. And sending these genetics out that would work in different parts of the world and in these developing countries to improve the natural cattle there, make efficient beef production in those harsh environments. Just the impact of those cattle from, we might consider back in the time would have been a huge herd, but relatively speaking, the impact that they've had a very small nucleus of animals. So it's just amazing to me how those cattle have had such an impact from basically a very small nucleus.
It is crazy.
Well, when you mention the impact, Brandon, in developing countries, I want you to think back to why the Sartwells got involved with the Indian cattle to start with. They owned 16,000 acres spread out over 4 counties on the Gulf Coast. There wasn't any way to make any money running cattle then. You had screwworm issues. You had all of the heat tolerant, all the heat, the waterborne disease issues, kind of down in that marsh country, down in those coastal counties that was there. And these Brahman cattle were an answer to make find the cattle that fit the environment instead of trying to do it the other way around. And when you even look at impacts we've been able to make here very recently on shipping cattle to different parts of the world, here 130 years later, they're trying to do the exact same thing. Is find some cattle with some function, and the ability to allow the land to generate some income above just a subsistence level.
I was just thinking the other day, even here where we live, it gets pretty hot and humid. But for the most part, our pastures are fairly manicured, can fertilize from time to time. We can offer supplemental feed. Our cattle are living a cush life compared to cattle back then versus, or even cattle now that are, say, down in the saltgrass or somewhere on some of the super tough country in South Texas or something. But back in those early days, when they only had the Barra grade cattle to work with and all that, that Brahman blood was getting diluted. And even here, like I was talking about with our manicured pastures, I'm using air quotes, manicured pastures and all this kind of stuff where the cattle are live in cush environments, we can't handle anything less than a quarter Brahman to be productive and maintain efficiency. So even back then, when those Barra grade cattle were getting diluted down, you're getting down to 8ths and 16ths and all that. they really needed some kind of influx. And I guess that's where these pioneers between O'Connors and Borden's and Shanghai Pierce and Ward Company and your great granddad and so many of those guys comes in to see that need and actually go out and get it. Those guys that traveled over to India to huge expense and spent so much. I'm sure it had to take months and months of
I'd assume millions too. If you change it to today's currency
inflation
level to
calculator.
get those
Yeah,
cattle over here, probably cost them millions of dollars. I
yeah.
would
To
think.
me, that's so mind blowing. To think about the foresight and the grit that these guys had to go back and do it, and then just to throughout the generations to maintain it. That's awesome, and that's why these Brahman cattle are so fascinating to me.
Well, they take on the character of their caretakers. I really never say owners, um, because when you find yourself face to face with a Bremer cow, it's you spend enough time looking at her, and you look in those eyes, and you kind of wonder who the boss is most of the time, anyway. Even on a gentle cow, but it's these were people. They tended to be people of very strong religious fervor as well, and they believed when you go back and read the letters that these brothers wrote back and forth to each other. I mean, they wrote love stories back and forth talking about these cattle. And it was a true ideal of theirs. It was an ideal. It was an ideal of Walter Hudgens. It was an ideal of States Jacobs. It was an ideal of Mr. Henry Kuntz. And I look at I tell JD and Brock all the time. I said I hope that I believe in something during my lifetime as much as JW and his peers believed in these cattle, because what they faced, ridicule. I mean, the whole reason the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo exists is because they peeved off JW so bad at Fort Worth in 1922, 23, and 24, that by God, he did like we did. And he said, if I'm ever in charge of things, we're going to have an exposition to showcase these cattle instead of ridicule. And it's I don't know. I think the three organizations that on the Texas side of the deal, between founding ABBA, most of the early ABBA people were big supporters of the Houston Fat Stock Show when it started, and almost all of them had their operating money through the Houston Agricultural Credit Corporation out of Houston, and they all sat on the same boards. They all drank the same Kool-Aid. And thank God for them, because it would have been easy for them. The 24, the hoof and mouth outbreak that wipes out a lot of the Jacobs cattle in late 1924. The freeze, the Christmas Eve freeze in 1924 that kills 40% of Sartwelle cattle, kills big chunks of the Hudgens cattle. At any point in time, it would have sure been easy for them to quit.
That's right. And I'd hate to put myself in that situation because I might have been the one throwing the towel.
Well, my granddad JD always said it was easy for them to risk everything because they didn't have that much to lose.
Yeah,
That's good. Well, that actually kind of leads us in a direction, Jimmy, and we can kind of pole vault to some of your great grandfather's contributions, and specifically talked about the Houston Livestock Show, or what was the Houston Fat Stock Show back then. But could you tell us just a little bit more about that? That's always been super fascinating to me, between Port City and Houston Livestock Show. I'd say I don't know if there's anybody that had a bigger impact on Texas agriculture, and I really do believe that. So, yeah, tell us a little bit about your great grandfather.
He was born in 1887. His father was an Episcopal priest who was a church planter for the Diocese of Texas, the Episcopal Diocese of Texas, and he had 7 children that were born in 7 different cities, because he'd plant a church. He'd plant a church and get it started, have a kid there, and then move on to the next one. and having others. JW was born in 1887 in Dallas when he was busy planting a church there. The family wound up settling in Comanche, Texas, um, and it's a interesting story for a later time how they wound up in Central Texas. But he was one of seven children. His brother Dinsmore was really the unsung hero of the family, and one of the more unsung heroes of the Brahman breed. But Dinsmore never married. A sister, the younger sister Helen, never married, and they wound up spending their entire lives all the way to their death after moving to Palacios in 1913 and 14. They died there in the late 50s and early 60s. JW, being one of the younger children, of course, as is always the case, the older ones stay and run the family business, and the younger ones get kicked out of the nest. He worked for the after finishing kind of the equivalent of an Episcopal finishing school in Buffalo, New York, where his brother-in-law, the man who'd married his older sister, was the headmaster and an Episcopal priest in his right. All those boys went to DeVoe College which was basically a high school / junior college, and you got to stay until the next brother's turn was to come. So a couple of them graduated. A couple of them, like JW, only got 2 years before he got kicked out and had to come home. Went to work for the railroad. Um, he gets back to Palacios there with the cows in 20. Is elected mayor of Palacios about a year after he gets there. He's very active in the St. John's Episcopal Church there in Palacios. Um, meets his intended Laura Charlotte Arnold, and they get married. They start their family down there in Palacios, with my grandfather, born in 1921. They're blowing and going. They've got the ward. They've got the ward lock cattle that they've gotten into. They've gotten under one management. They're cross fencing. They're doing all kinds of manual labor down there. Um, he helps Honcho and winds up with the sixth, and then with Imperator the seventh of those imported bulls there in 24, and then boom, the Christmas Eve freeze there in December of 24 that comes in, stays in for better than a week. Cattle just drifted up in fence lines, froze, died. Next ones would come in on top of them, and they found cows drifted down on the south ends of all those pastures, and they wound up losing about 40% of about 3,000 cows total between the Brahman cows and the commercial cattle that they'd bought from Mr. Locke. Pretty quick. Remember, they'd borrowed money to buy those cattle, so they've still got note payments due. So they went from the one old maid sister and the five brothers all down there in Palacios to in pretty short order. One brother left in the and sister Helen. JW went to Houston, started selling real estate, went to law school at night, got his law degree, practiced, defended a friend of his in court one time. They lost so badly. He was so bad in court. He never took another client
I've
on.
never heard that before. That's funny.
So he's sitting there in Houston, and he's what he and a real unsung hero of the family was brother Pascal, who went by Pat. Pat went to Lake Charles and started working for the Southwest Louisiana Livestock Loan Company. Now, put a pin in that one, because he winds up really important, because he wound up financing lots of people over in Louisiana, the Dominics, the Marceaus, Charles Alsabrooks, lots of folks over there. And when he financed them, they all wanted to buy Brahman cattle, and a whole lot of them wound up coming to Palacios to buy cattle from Sartwelle brothers. So that's how a lot of the Brahman cattle wound up getting back over there. Brother went to San Antonio to go work for Humble Oil Company, now Exxon. One of them went to Del Rio, where his wife's family had land, and he ranched and raised sheep and goats down there. Wound up in the insurance business, and what all of them did was they sent every nickel they could back to Palacios, back to Dinsmore, to operate the ranch and to try like heck to keep up with the loan payments on those cows. Um, they finally paid those cattle off, paid that original note off in 1949. But
So
to
how many years
backtrack,
was that again, Jimmy?
huh?
How many years were they paying on that note?
They took it out. It was 29 years that they paid on it.
That's incredible. People
Took it
don't
out in November of 20
realize.
and got it paid off like in September of 49. They had a deed burning down there. That was a lot of fun. But so JW is there in Houston, and he is trying to figure out why we're shipping cattle off the Gulf Coast, either to New Orleans, to the terminal yard there, or to Fort Worth to sell, when all the railroads cross. There's Buffalo Bayou, all right there in Houston. So he spends the latter 20s building interest among business interests there in Houston, um, uh, to uh, to build a livestock market, which culminates there in March of 1931 with the founding of Port City Stockyards Company and the Port City Packing Company, which wound up being a major meat packer there in Houston. But Swift wound up building a plant down there. Armour had a plant. Um, the old stockyards that the family was very involved with, and had 8 or 9 commission companies spread out all over the yards that handled private treaty sales for commission. Um, when he got that off the ground, he figured that he did some talking, and he figured out the International was in Chicago, the National Western Stock Show was in Denver, Southwestern Exposition was in Fort Worth. The Louisville Stock Show was where Louisville was every major marketing center of beef cattle in the country had a livestock exposition associated with it. So lots of the same names that signed the charter of the Port City Stockyards and Packing Companies in March of 31 were there later that year when they started the Houston Fat Stock Show, which of course had its first run in January of 32.
And where was the original Port City located? Just for people that are going to end up listening, just curious.
If you take I-45 south out of downtown Houston, when you start getting to the exits for the University of Houston, there's an exit for Calhoun Road, and it was located west of what now is I-45. And a big chunk of the newer part of the U of H campus is actually on the old Port City property.
And there's nothing that stands left of it.
There's a historical marker that was put up down there, but no, there's nothing left. The state Texas Highway Department in the late 50s had a plan to take Texas 35 and where it's going to extend it, that comes up from West Columbia, Angleton through Alvin. And they were going to bring 35 into downtown Houston. And that was the path that they were going to bring it over. So through a series of eminent domain and sales, we moved Port City out to Sealy in 1968. We kept the export facilities that were there at Port City that were jointly run with TDA until the mid 1970s. And in just kind of a really weird take, one of the barns that folks were stalled under at the first National Brahman Show that was held out at the Rosenberg Fairgrounds was the old Port City export barn that was bought by the Fort Bend County Fairgrounds and deconstructed and then reconstructed out on the fairgrounds down there. So there's just kind of little interesting tidbits about Port City heading out their tentacles over the years as well.
Elevate your herd with the finest Brahman heifers from BRC Ranch. Perhaps you need to replace ranch heifers or you're sourcing elite show heifers and donor prospects. BRC Ranch understands your passion for Brahmins. We feel the same. Building a strong foundation is essential for long-term success, and we invite you to see our exceptional Brahmin heifers in person. Schedule a visit to our ranch by going online to brcatrer.com and selecting a suitable time slot. That's brcatrer.com.
Well, I guess we talk about this a lot. We've traveled the country. Me, you, and Brandon probably have had as much fun just getting to travel around and hang out and talk about Brahman cattle almost like little kids. We've talked about the impact of Imperator cattle, and we've talked about in some of our travels the distinct look that those cattle have. Could you just kind of describe to us, I guess, things that when you say it's looking through cattle, you say ding, 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 that's an Imperator. I can tell because of ...
The pigment generally is the first giveaway on it. Those cattle have kind of really almost doesn't matter what outcrosses that we've used over the years, and we're funny because over the years we use Manso cattle to outcross with, which would put us different than just about everybody else in the breed. But the pigment does tend to bleed through. Most of the cattle that you can look at today, you go find some Manso bred cattle, it'll show up with a gray orange spot on them somewhere. You can go back deep enough, and you can find some bulls that left Palacios. To go do that, the cattle tend to have a different look to them about the poll. They're kind of from their poll to their muzzle. Their eyes generally are located a little bit further down the head than most what we consider pure Manso cattle to be. And a really peculiar trait of these cattle, they will develop and have just not only a slightly longer tail than most Manso bred Brahman cattle, but they generally will have a fuller and longer switch. So you can look a lot at what I consider kind of our classic Imperator cows that we still have down here in the brush country today, and the switches, if they're not dragging the ground, they're coming pretty close to dragging the ground. And when you look in lots of the magazines and even look at some older cattle of other breeding now, you got the bottom of the switch kind of a lot of cases doesn't even go halfway down the hock in the back. And but what the cattle have kind of been have come to been known for is, as we've gone through feeding trials and developed some genetic testing for some carcass traits, is, beneath the hide, they're thought of to be on the upper end of the tenderness scale. They're thought of to be on the positive end of the marbling scale. Our cattle over the years have not only tended to have that, they've also tended to be on the positive end of the fat thickness in terms of less rump slash waist fat thickness as well. But you can kind of go in if I look at the switch and if I can have a good look right straight in the eye on them, I can do generally a pretty good job and some of the herds that we visited in the last year and a half that have consciously put some Imperator breeding back into their cattle. That kind of tends to be the giveaway that comes from them. They've been a longer lived cattle than most of the outcross cattle that we've picked up. Um, any discussion of fertility in Brahman cattle needs to last a whole lot longer than we're going to talk about here. But we've been pleased with the general degree of fertility in these cattle, the higher percentage of Imperator blood that they have in them. They tend not to be as big frame size wise. Now, I will say out there, 95% of the people of any breed who tell you that they know what their mature cows breed are lying because they're just guessing. Because none of us weigh our cows, uh, but a kind of classic bred Sartwelle Imperator cow. She's gonna be a frame 5.5 to a 6. She's gonna weigh gobby fat. She's gonna weigh maybe 12. Um, which at 3% of her body weight per day in dry matter is a whole lot different than a 1,500-pound cow.
That's no doubt. That is no doubt.
Well, I thought I just had, Jimmy, was we've talked a lot of Sartwelle brothers. We've talked a lot of JW, but there's still two more generations till we get to you, So there's
Right.
first JD, and then the second JD, of course, as everybody knows, as Bubba, and who I like to consider as the godfather of the F1 cow, and his super contributions to the beef industry as a whole, and then of course the entire Sartwelle family seems to just, if there's one word that describes the Sartwelle family or might go hand in hand with that, would be a service. There's just a whole spirit of service through that family. But come on down through JD 1, 2, and then 3 yourself. Kind of, what's some other things that stand out as highlights?
Oh, my grandfather is probably the least known today. He served ABBA all the way up through ascending to first vice president there in the early 70s. He was active in the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo. He and my grandmother married when he was 16 and she was 17 in 1938. Had 5 children, had a girl on either end. My dad was the oldest of 3 boys there in the middle. But J.D. Sartwelle for basically a 11th grade dropout of San Jacinto High School in Houston, was one of the more innately intelligent and innovative people I've ever met. Like I said, he was born in 1921. Goes to work full time at the stockyards there in 38. And stays employed by the Stockyards Company all the way up through his death in 2002 rather. He was a really, I think probably the trait that he got from his father. He was a visionary. His passion was finding a way to increase value of his customers' cattle. He worked with Everett Harris, who was the president of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. And basically, J.D. Sartwelle had the idea for the live cattle futures contract, which has been traded on the CME, now CBOT, continually since 1964. But Everett Harris, when Everett Harris wrote his autobiography at the end of his service as the president of the Chicago Board of Trade, a great innovator in his own right, he gave full credit for the development of the live cattle futures contract to J.D. Sartwelle, who was always phenomenally interested in improving price discovery, and I think part of the reason why goes back to spending his life at the knee of J.W. Sartwelle, who continually fought the prejudice against Brahman-blooded cattle. And if there's one thing I think that animated J.W., that animated J.D., that animated my dad, and at some level animates everything I do with these cows, is we're still 100-something years in. We still are one of the few breeds of cattle that's called upon every day to prove it all over again. But he was a master innovator from the live cattle futures contract. He was one of the first to embrace the thought that you could video cattle and out in the country and bring them into ballrooms or bring them into movie theaters or wherever it was and show those moving images and market cattle that way with Texas video cattle contracts that he and my dad picked up and innovated there in the mid to late 70s. That was one of the cases where they were ahead of their time. Basically, they had an idea for Superior before they figured out how to broadcast these things on satellite. Um, Actually conducted sales off the video, but typical deal. You get on the wrong side of technology with Betamax instead of VHS and things like that. But he just never quit. He and Dad and my Uncle Bill started the first commingled feeder pig sales in Texas, starting in the early 1970s. That continued for 35 years. After the fact, Dad innovated the commingled pre-sorted feeder cattle sales there at our Brenham livestock auction. There in the late '80s, early '90s. Again, that continued for a long period of time. So it was a spirit of he was animated by how can you increase value for that calf, that pen of calves, that cull cow, that bull, that hog, as it stands there, that you're entrusted as a marketing agent to maximize the value for your customer. J.D. Sartwelle was one of the more formal guys that very rarely ever seen without a coat, if not a suit and tie on. But the man knew a cow from one end to the other, and he dang sure understood marketing as well, with the exception of his son, as anybody I ever knew. We talked about spreading these cattle out all over the world. Dad was born in 1940, gets out of A&M in '63. He was a Corps member, serves his military hitch, and winds up finishing up as a civil affairs officer at Fort Clayton in the Canal Zone in Panama, as a marketing liaison to the Panamanian Minister of Agriculture. So he spent the last 18 months that he was in the Army putting his Army uniform on one day a week in the Canal Zone, and the other 6 days a week he was visiting ranches in Panama, helping them develop improvement plans, and then helping facilitate lots and lots of Brahman cattle exports from lots of ranches in the state of Texas back down to Panama. From that point, when he gets out of the Army in '66, he came back to the ranch. When we moved from a terminal livestock market in Houston in '60 to Sealy, and bought the Sealy livestock auction, he moves up as general manager, and again he was employed by Port City again until we ceased operations and sold the facility for real estate in 2011. Dad's first set of cows that he bought when he got out of the Army, he went, those cattle, if memory serves, those cattle were somewhere in Caldwell County outside of somewhere around Luling, but it was Audrey Jones Beck. And Audrey Jones Beck had her dad had bought a bunch of cattle. She was the granddaughter of Jesse Jones, who was the great financier in Houston, owned the Houston Chronicle, was the mover and shaker in Houston for 50 years. Audrey Beck had these Jacobs Gujarat cows that Dad bought. And when Dad bought that set of 130, 140 cows there late in '66, a third of them were bred to Brahman bulls, a third of them were bred to Hereford bulls, and a third of them were bred to Shorthorn bulls. He took those cows back to Palacios, calved them out, and that was his real firsthand experience with the F1s. If you got him talking long enough, all the way up till he died, it was really that set of pure Gujarat AA bred Audrey Jones Beck cows that really weren't much in terms of phenotype, but bred to the and he always said those half Shorthorn, half Brahman cattle might have been the very best F1s that he ever raised. He started breeding for Sartwelle Brothers down there at the old ranch He bred lots of cows in 68, 69, 70, and 71. Hereford, Shorthorn, and bred brown Swiss bulls to the last third of them to great effect in seeing the types of calves and the heifers that he kept back off those cows down there in that horribly inhospitable country. Um, I really think that was the passion Dad had for the F1s came off those double A Gujarat bred cows that he bought from the Beck estate there in the late '60s. That fire never ever went out in him.
No, that's awesome. And I think we would be remiss. We talked about all the guys in the Sartwelle family, but I think we would be remiss to not mention or pass over some of the great female contributions as well. Between your mother, Miss Shuggy, ties with Livestock Marketing Association as well as Texas Beef Council, along with Beth. I just entirely lots of service throughout, and I feel privileged and blessed to know you guys. And but next question, just kind of as we lean toward wrapping this thing up, is what's going on at Sartwelle Brothers or Sartwelle Brahman Ranch now, and kind of where do you see the future? I mean, you've got a number 4 behind you, and Brock as well. Whoa. Kind of what's going on now? What's in the future?
We moved these cows down here to Campbellton, which is between. I always laugh, tell people, they say, "Where's Campbellton?" I say, "Well, it's between Fall City and Christine." And you're going to know that's where we are. But here, about 25 miles south of Pleasanton, these cows have since 1920. They've been in 3 extraordinarily different environments, from the saltgrass country down there at Palacios for 52 years. Then they spend 1972 to 2016, which is 44 years at Sealy on basically like you described, 100% improved pastures, high fertility, coastal Bermuda, a little bit of overseeded clover. Down here since 2016 in some pretty native, pretty rough, very deep sand down here on the banks of the Atascosa River. Um, a few things that we've had to change since we've come down here is we were about an 80% spring calving herd at Sealy because that fit our grass. Down here, that does not fit our grass with whatever the opposite of a monsoon is that we get in July and August every year. It's just super tough. We calve these March calves out. Man, they're going great guns until about the end of June, and they're at about 100 and 115 days. The water shuts off, and it winds up being a little bit of a challenge to the extent that we've moved back. Really to about a 75% fall calving herd down here now. What we've done, and we've had to pair out some old cows in the last several years. We've concentrated more back around our broader core, specifically using the SBR Imperator Buck Marceau 37 with a 7 bull that you guys have used, that Brett Nobbs has taken to Australia, that folks have taken from Botswana to the Philippines and lots of places in between, kind of concentrating around him, which um, he's out of a pretty pure Sartwelle Imperator type cow, sired by the old Duffy Marceau 150 bull. What we've concentrated around, and we're like a lot of people. You're at a crossroads. You can either continue doing what you're doing, or you can go with what would probably be considered some more mainstream breeding, and never beat folks at their own game. We've doubled down on the Imperator breeding. You mentioned my mother. Since Dad died in November of 22. She laughs and says maybe we've done some things a little bit faster than if Dad was still alive, and she's probably right about some things. She's 78. She wants to see some things, but while she's got an opportunity to watch them go. We're pretty excited. We're probably not any different than any folks. We do not own 100 Brahman cows. We're sitting here. We're sitting here on what we are. I've got a tremendous set of yearling to 3-year-old, fairly intensely Imperator females that we're pretty excited about, that are sired by this 37 bull, sired by a son of his. We've reached outside. We're breeding a bull that Horse Stomp over in Mississippi raised, that Dad fell in love with as a baby calf on the cow. It took him a year to negotiate with Jess Brown and Mr. Lewis to get the bull back over here. That we've used to basically Kempfer and a lot of Marone breeding, which means a lot of Imperator breeding in him. We've used him as well. Went to the University of Florida and bought a bull from them that we bought specifically. I'm the last person in the world that's going to pick on single trait selection. But I think if our cattle need to be picked up in any way, just a little more internal dimension. I'm satisfied with depth of body. I'm satisfied with udder and tit quality under the cows. Pretty satisfied with the sheaths that we have under our bulls. I think the cattle are correct enough. There just needs to be just a touch more of them. We have to be real careful about where we're going outside to do it. I think the bull I'm most excited about that is a 100% outcross to us, just on the basis of the first probably 10, 11 calves that have been born, both at Bowling and down here, is y'all's BRC 160 over an 8. I think he's the right kind. I think he's the kind that I can build a set of half-blood Manso, half-blood Sartwelle Imperator cattle around, and then take back the Imperator direction, but maintain the. I'm going to start with what I've liked out of the 160 Imperator crosses that I've seen. I'll start with the fact that I love their correctness. I love their correctness of lines. I love the fact that we don't appear to have done anything to mess up the underlines under these cattle that my dad spent 25 years trying to clean up. But just the added oomph, the added horsepower, the added performance that he and some selected genetics like him are going to bring in. I don't know. Again, I'm not the geneticist, but I think our future and what I'm excited about, Brandon, is I do think there is such a thing as inbreed hybrid vigor. And these cattle that we have are so dissimilar from almost everybody else's cattle. I think we've got to be very, very careful about which outside blood we bring in to put the needed horsepower to them. I think I found the cattle because I found the philosophy going all the way back to what I started with. When I talked about those old guys. The cattle follow the owners. They take on the philosophy, they take on the personality of the owners if they're able to hold on to them and breed them long enough. And we've been tremendously pleased with the back and forth that we've been able to do with you guys there at BRC. And I think it's just a bright future all the way around for these Imperator cattle. There's not a lot of them out there. There are some other folks that have maintained. But to the degree of pretty faithful line breeding, we've still got a little core of 25, 30 cows here that there ain't many people around got one or two like we've got a couple of dozen of. So that's the foundation of the future, and just evangelizing, because telling the story of your cattle or my cattle, or anybody else's Brahman cattle, we're telling the Brahman story, and that's the most important thing. And that's the way I know that I'm being true to the people who came before.
Yeah, that's awesome. And just like you're saying, what you're seeing between bringing in the new bloodlines here and there, and just adding a little freshness that's needed from time to time within our own herd, and with the use of 37 with a 7. as well as the 467 with a 6 cow, the 503 with a 6 cow that we've used within our own herd. I think out of all the females produced from those crosses of the SBR cattle with our BRC cattle, we've kept all the females. There's been 2 or 3 fantastic bull calves out of that deal. Something we can definitely gives us a lot of gas for the future in terms of genetic diversity. And I've really been pleased with the function that's been added to our program as well as the genetic diversity. It's like you said, I think the future is bright. But as we prepare to wrap this up, I think we've got 2 questions we want to ask that we're going to kind of be a deal we've asked with ourselves on the first podcast. But as we go through the future, we got 2 questions we want to ask to all of our guests.
Definitely. Jimmy, jump in here and tell you thank you first and foremost. Me and Brandon both look up to you as much as anybody in this breed. And so awesome stories. But we're going to wrap up with these 2 questions, and hopefully this becomes a fun thing as we go through. First one is, tell me your biggest pet peeve in Brahman right now. What is it? Something that is a burr in your side in the Brahman breed right now?
Oh, a burr in my side in the breed right now is the true lack of fertility in most of the cattle. When we describe a Brahman cow, we talk about her maternal traits, we talk about her fertility, and we invariably get back to the fact that she will hook your butt if you try to get after her calf. And I do think that's something that we really need to go back to working on is getting back closer to some cows that'll calve every year under range conditions. I don't know. I think there's a lot of cattle that are selected on the virtue of a general phenotype that really don't pay a whole lot of attention to reproductive efficiency. That's my peeve. And when I point, that's that old deal. And when you point the finger, there's 3 fingers pointing back at you, and I'm as guilty of it as anybody.
No, that would be pretty high up there on my list too. Okay, the last question, and we'll wrap this episode up with, Jimmy, what's your favorite Brahman of all time?
My favorite Brahman animal of all time? My favorite Brahman animal of all time is a cow number 399 Bar that was raised down at the ranch. That is the only cow that she sired 2 herd bulls for us. The Nobalaya bull, which is an interesting story because he was an outcross off a bull that we borrowed in 1950 from Mr. Henry Kuntz. So he was a lot of Suva the first breeding. It was a tremendous outcross. We used that bull from 58 to 72. But that cow is a cow that her mount hangs on the wall in my living room. She died at 18 and had 13 calves, which under those circumstances was a pretty deal. But I look at her every day, and she remains the ideal cow for me, of a Gujarat head, ear set, eye set on one. When I make one as good as her, I'll know I did something.
Next time we're down there, I've got to go in.
I don't know how we haven't been in your house and seen this mount yet, but we are definitely going to do that. But Jimmy, thank you so much. Give your family a big hug from both of us and from us here at BRC. I guess we'll go ahead and wrap it up here, Brandon.
Like I said, thank you, Jimmy. I think this was a perfect way to start off as our first guest in our podcast, with the legacy that your family has left, the spirit of service, as we talked about earlier. Thanks again so much, Jimmy, and we'll be seeing you down the road.
Appreciate y'all very much. Merry Christmas to everyone.
Hey guys, we hope that you're enjoying the Over the Hump podcast. We've had so many great reviews and great feedback from this podcast, and we've had several people asking how they can support it. So we are proud to announce that we've created the Over the Hump fan club, where you can join and sign up on a yearly basis to help support this podcast and get some really cool merch as well. We have 3 different levels ranging from $40 a year to $250 a year. And at each level, you get some really cool different benefits and different free gifts. For example, at our Trailblazer level, you get a free copy of my really awesome Modern Brahmin coffee table book, which is a 160-page coffee table book featuring the gorgeous photography of Carlos Guizora from Mexico, along with Brahmin history written by me. And then our Supreme Stockman level, which is $250 a year, includes that plus free access to the Brahmin Academy for 1 year. And at our Trailblazer and Supreme Stockman levels, you also get a discount to use in the BRC online store, which you can use for anything that's in the store, including semen, AI certificates, show cattle camp, event registrations, and more. So this is a really great opportunity, especially if you purchase a lot of semen or AI certificates from us. You can join the fan club and get some great discounts to use throughout the whole year. So if you like this podcast and want to help support it, you can sign up for the Over the Hump fan club at shopbrcutrer.com. That's shopbrcutrer.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you are enjoying it.
You've been listening to the Over the Hump podcast. Our passion is Brahman cattle, and it runs deep. And this show is about its rich history, industry trends, and stories that define the American Brahmin. We hope you've enjoyed the show. If you did, make sure to like, rate, review, and subscribe. We'll be back soon. But in the meantime, find us on Instagram and Facebook at BR Cutrer. See you next time on the Over the Hump podcast.